Commissioner, thank you very much for talking to the Press Observatory of LIAMEP, the Hellenic Foundation for European Foreign Policy. I'd like to start with an observation and also pick up to something you said recently in Berlin. We observe that in the European Union and the Eurozone, unemployment rates are very high still, and considerably higher than, for example, the United States or the OECD average. And also we observe that there are quite substantial differentials between unemployment rates between different countries in Europe. So it seems that we have a pan-European problem, at the one hand compared to other regions in major countries, and also distinct cases of national problems. Recently you said in Berlin that the handling of the crisis so far has not helped really the situation in terms of unemployment, the fiscal consolidation, austerity approach, if you like. So given this situation and given the handling of the crisis as has progressed so far, what do you think should be done both at the European level, but also what should member states, especially countries like Greece, Spain, and so on, who have major problems, should do?
Well, it is true that historically unemployment has been higher in Europe than in the United States or Japan. Despite the fact that in the first period of the financial crisis, 2008 and 9, Europe responded quite well. After the start of the Eurozone crisis, we experienced not only an increase of overall unemployment rates, but also a massive divergence in the European Union. And this is what needs to be stressed, because in the pre-crisis decade, there was a lot of convergence in countries where there was a high level of unemployment before, like Germany, like Spain, for example. They managed to bring it down. While at the time of the crisis, there's been a polarization between the core and the periphery of the Eurozone. This has been driven by the crisis itself, the fact that financial fragmentation has lasted too long and caused a lot of damage. It put pressure on a number of countries, and indeed the fiscal adjustment resulted in rapid increase of unemployment in both public and private sectors in the countries affected. We have been calling for a rebalancing of the employment strategy, especially since the employment package of the Commission in 2012 April, that practically means more demand side of measures, because purely through activation or developing skills at the time of a recession, you cannot really produce short-term results. We have worked on a specific flagship initiative for the young people, the Youth Guarantee, which will help to limit the length of unemployment for the young people, those under 25. And we also have been encouraging cross-border mobility because of these asymmetries. Very often people do not find a job in their home country or home region, easily find one in another EU member state where there is actually a stronger demand for labor. So the crisis requires a different type of response than in the past.
All right. Do you see these initiatives you mentioned as a response in the short term? And if so, what should be done more structurally, like in the long term, and especially at the European level? Because in countries such as Greece, Spain, Cyprus, and so on, it will certainly, I think you would agree with me, take many years before the unemployment rates come down to pre-crisis levels. So perhaps in the meantime, some of the initiatives you mentioned can be helpful, but what should be done more generally, as you say, to bring, as you said before, even before the crisis, Europe had a higher on average unemployment rate compared to other regions. What could it change in the way the European economy works more generally?
Well, Europe needs to do more to overcome these divergences. This is a fundamental question, to rebalance the Eurozone and ensure that growth can pick up faster. Until recently, we saw a lot of hesitation, for example, from the side of the European Central Bank, while we know that monetary policy also needs to be supportive of an economic recovery, and it is only the central bank which can do something about the risk of deflation. So sometimes there is hesitation, but I think it has been well identified what kind of measures can contribute to a more robust economic recovery in the European Union, which would also allow jobs to come back in larger numbers. In many countries, this is also a question of domestic labour market reforms. For example, in Greece, but also Italy or Spain, the fact that the labour markets themselves were not sufficiently resilient resulted in a rapid rise of joblessness, and now it makes difficult to create jobs. That's why these labour market reforms are also very important, based on various components. The capacity of the public employment services needs to be strengthened, and for such measures you can also use the European funds, especially the European Social Fund.
I'd like to pick on two things you just said. One about the long-term policies, if you like, in addressing the more structural imbalances. Do you think that there's political appetite for these kinds of policies to go through at this moment?
Well, of course, you have to sequence everything and find a political way to implement the right reforms at the right time. It's also important to see when the fruits of a particular reform can be expected, because some of the labour market reforms can only produce a visible impact in the longer term. So at the time of the recession, you need a capacity for short-term intervention, relief, supporting those who become unemployed. Very often this is subsidized jobs for the young people, apprenticeships, traineeships, mobility schemes, and in the longer term you can expect that the structural reforms also produce a better environment for investment, and thus more hiring as well.
On the front of labour market reforms, I mean, you mentioned them as well. Many people here in Greece, but more generally, criticize them. But really, they are kind of masked, if you like, the regulation of the labour market that ultimately will hurt the employees. We saw recently a new decision in Greece, for example, for a collective dismissal in a particular plant. This is something new for Greece, and many people feel very critical, especially at the time when unemployment rates are very high. What would you say to this critique?
Well, the right level of regulation can be found inside the country, and the government should always look for it in a dialogue with the employers and the employees' organizations. Otherwise, the sustainability of any reform is in question. So it's very important there is a good social dialogue for the design as well as the implementation of the labour market reforms, and that's practically the key for a resilient labour market and a sustainable solution.
What about the social impacts of the crisis, in addition to, if you like, beyond unemployment? In Greece already we measure that 1 in 3 Greeks are in danger of risk of poverty or social exclusion. What tools and instruments do member states, especially in an era where they are forced to cut down social expenditures because of fiscal consolidation programs, have at their disposal, and how can the European Union, the Eurozone, help them in their efforts?
Well, indeed, at the time of high unemployment and fiscal consolidation, there is a great risk of increasing poverty in any country, but also in the European countries too. It's very important, first of all, to ensure that this period doesn't last very long, and the countries can emerge from this recession. But when there is a recession, various forms of support are important. In Greece or in Italy, the welfare safety nets have been not very strong. Minimum income schemes have been lacking. The social economy has been underdeveloped, and that's why the Commission's action also has been pointing to this direction, to help these countries to design adequate welfare safety nets, to help these countries to use the European funds, for example, to develop social enterprise, to strengthen social services. And in the recent years, we had a lot of efforts together with the Greek authorities to design the right legislative framework for a social economy, to be able to use EU resources for that purpose, and to save EU financial instruments like the aid for the most deprived, which in such times when there is an increasing demand for the supply of food banks, for example, can be used for supporting those people who need the help of the community.
A final question about labor mobility. You mentioned it yourself before. In Greece and other peripheral states, there's a lot of talk about the so-called brain drain. So we see this tendency of young, highly skilled people, especially since 2011-12, to migrate to northern countries in order to find jobs, because they're not able to do so in the southern peripheral countries. Now, according to economic theory, this might be a good thing. I mean, we would like more labor mobility in Europe, and it's part of the Eurozone project, if you like. But given the present circumstances, might this not be a problem which may undermine the growth potential of, in the short term at least, the recovery potential, if you like, of these southern peripheral countries?
Well, the brain drain is not a good thing either in practice or in theory. We speak about a brain drain where the highly skilled people are overrepresented among the migrant workforce. This is not always the case. This is not always the case. Very often, all different type of people decide to look for a job in another country, highly skilled, but also the low skilled or the semi-skilled. This is very often the case. However, it is true that in the last few years, from the southern European countries, there is probably an overrepresentation of the highly skilled. In the migration from east to west, which has been a pattern in the last 10 years from countries like Poland and Romania, we do not have such a strong evidence of a brain drain. However, the point is that any kind of restriction would not be a solution or the right answer to the so-called brain drain or a risk of that. You can do two things. One of them is to ensure that the peripheral countries regain their growth potential, and then if there is economic growth, there are job opportunities for locals but also foreigners. So the migration can be not a one-way street, but a more circular phenomenon. And secondly, you can also use the EU funds, especially the European Social Fund, to boost the capacity of education and also the higher education system. Very often, larger cohorts in higher education compensate for the brain drain, and people who leave for a few years, earn and learn in another environment, eventually return and benefit the local economy with the knowledge and their experience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.